Thank you again for everyone who are attending our March edition of Voices of AAPI. Looks like we have about 50 attendees. We'll wait for another minute. Maybe we'll start at 3:04, just to make sure we have everybody who wants to attend into the room. But we do have a lot to cover, so I don't want to take away from our speakers' time. So we'll start at 3:04. Great. Welcome welcome to the March edition of Voices of AAPI Community Briefing. My name is Kevin Hirano. I'm the Deputy Director at API Vote. And I'd like to thank our partners, API Data and the Asian American Journalists Association for co-hosting, as well as NORC and the Associated Press for their ongoing partnership for this incredibly important resource of data and insight into our fast-growing communities, particularly because this is such a critical election. So today we're going to be introducing 3 topics that were surveyed in the last month's installment of API Voices: reproductive rights, gender-affirming care, and other issues that will be most influential to the Asian American and Pacific Islander vote. I'd like to now welcome Karthik Ramakrishnan to review the main findings and introduce our program hosts and speakers. Karthik.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us again. We have a special treat today where we have Minnie Timaraju from Reproductive Freedom for All and Connie Choi from NAPOF joining us with some hot findings from our AP-Norc collaboration, and importantly, to give community perspective and insights and context to put these survey findings in the larger context of work that is underway in our communities. If we can share the slides, I will walk through some of the major findings from our study. So I'll just say a little bit about the API Data, AP-Norc partnership. Next slide, please. So this is our partnership with the Associated Press and NORC at the University of Chicago. Each of us brings different strengths and expertise to the table when it comes to this collaboration. We at API Data have over 15 years of survey research and expertise in API communities, which includes not only social science research expertise, but also community engaged work. Our focus is on public impact with our framework of data, narrative, and action. We are thrilled to be in this work with the Associated Press, which has longstanding expertise in data journalism, high trust and credibility across the United States, and with wide reach through hundreds of local, state, and national publications. And finally, NORC at the University of Chicago is a global leader in objective, nonpartisan research with a stellar reputation in social science and survey methodology, and already has a strong partnership with the Associated Press on data-informed storytelling. This is the 4th poll in a series of 6 polls that we are doing with the Associated Press and NORC. Next slide. So I'll just say what the key findings are in this report, which was released a few days ago. It was released late last week. And you can go to the API Data website, to our blog, or you can go to apnorc.org to see those findings. And in those findings, and in fact, in the featured image of the report, you will see a featured image of Congresswoman Judy Chu in handcuffs protesting. Protesting the removal of reproductive rights by the Supreme Court last year. Key findings from our survey report, which include findings on reproductive rights and abortion policy, as well as on gender-affirming care, as well as other policy issues. 79%, much higher than the US average, 79% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders believe that access to abortion should be legal in all cases or in most cases. And 75% want Congress to pass a national law guaranteeing access to abortion nationwide. Second major finding, 56% support counseling for transgender adults, while 47% support it for minors. 46% back gender-affirming hormone therapy for adults, while a smaller proportion support it for minors. And then finally, we had an innovative way of trying to get at this kind of litmus test support, if you will. If there's a candidate who holds a position on an issue that you disagree with, would you still vote for the candidate? We had a range of issues that we asked them about. And what we found was that racism and racial discrimination was at the top of the heap. This was surprising to us. I'll just say for me personally, I've been doing survey research on Asian Americans since 2008. And this was at the top of the list. 79% said that they could not vote for a candidate that they disagreed with when it comes to racism and racial discrimination. I feel like this is one of those underappreciated aspects of the 2024 election and something to watch out for. Abortion is number 2 on that list at 68%. And then even though we're seeing a lot of coverage on the role of the Israel-Gaza conflict or the conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians, however one wants to frame up this issue, only 54%, at the lowest among the list that we had, said that they could vote for a candidate who disagreed. Actually, 54% said they could indeed vote for a candidate who disagreed with them on that issue. So let's go into those findings. Next slide. Okay, so this is repeating what you'll find in the AP-Norc report. I'll just highlight a few of them and then go into some deeper dives before we get to this community conversation. So first of all, one of the benefits of doing this work with AP-Norc is that we're able to compare findings for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with the national average, replicating questions that the Associated Press and NORC have asked in recent surveys. So when you compare to what AAPI adult opinion is in February of this year compared to June of last year, when AP-Norc asked it for everyone, we see that over a third support abortion being legal in all cases when it comes to API adults compared to a quarter of US adults. And if you combine the legal in all cases and legal in most cases, you get to that 79% of support among API adults compared to a majority, but still lower level of support among US adults. There are differences by partisanship, not surprising here, but importantly, a majority of API Republicans support abortion being legal in all cases or in most cases. That is a big deal. That is different from the US average. And we also see some differences between those who are religiously affiliated versus religiously unaffiliated. But note that even among those who are religiously affiliated, 71% support it either in all cases or in most cases. Next slide. In terms of guaranteeing access to legal abortions nationwide, 3/4 of API adults support this compared to 60% of the American average. A lot stronger support among Democrats than Republicans, but look at that, 51% of API Republicans support Congress passing a law guaranteeing access to legal abortion nationwide. So that is very different from what you see with the general population and an important part of the narrative, right? When people think about reproductive justice or abortion rights or however one wants to call it, when one talks about voters who care about this and want to guarantee access, we have to be thinking about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in addition to other groups. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of, there are different bans or attempts to limit access to abortion in various states in the country based on different weeks into the pregnancy. And we find that the vast majority of API adults believe that abortion should be legal 15 weeks into the pregnancy. And in fact, if you look at 24 weeks into the pregnancy, 41% of API adults compared to 27% of US adults believe that abortion should be legal. Next slide. Most API adults also favor health insurance coverage of abortion. And these were not questions that were replicated in a prior AP-Norc survey. And we hope that future surveys of the general population will tap into support for insurance coverage, including not just private health insurance, but also state public health insurance programs. Next slide. And beyond abortion, we also asked about other aspects of reproductive health. including access to prenatal care, access to family planning services and birth control, as well as access to gender-affirming care for transgender and non-binary people. And what we found was that about a third of API adults believe that it's too difficult for people to access various forms of healthcare, including reproductive healthcare. Next slide. Finally, when it comes to that litmus test issue, this is what I was talking about. We saw that very few APIs could vote for a candidate that they disagreed with when it comes to racism and discrimination. And similarly, when it comes to abortion policy. On the other end of the spectrum, we find that only 45% say that they could not vote for someone that they disagreed with when it comes to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, let's take a look at some deeper dives here. Let's go to the next slide. And this will be available later on through our slide deck. So when we dig deeper by ethnicity and other differences within our community, we do see variations on a theme. Many of these differences, by the way, given the sample sizes, are not statistically significant, but some of them are. So for example, when you look at the Asian American opinion, right, when you add the 44 plus 36, that adds to 80% supported abortion in all cases or in most cases. For Pacific Islanders, it's lower than that. You'll add the 34 and the 29 to get the point estimate for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander adults, and that's at 63%. We don't see as much difference in terms of the proportion by Asian ethnicity, saying legal in all cases. But we do see differences, for example, between Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans when you combine those two categories. It's very likely that religion plays a role here, with Filipinos being overwhelmingly Catholic and Chinese Americans overwhelmingly not affiliated with any religion. Next slide. We also see differences by partisanship, as the report with AP-Norc indicates, and not as much differences by age, interestingly enough, as one might have thought. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of differences by nativity, language spoken at home, and by gender, we don't find much in the way of difference, except in the case of believing that abortion should be legal in all cases. Women, much more likely than men, at 41% versus 29%, say that they believe that abortion should be legal in all cases. So this is for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders together as a group. Next slide. Other differences that we can look at relate to policy, whether the Congress should pass a law guaranteeing access to abortion nationwide. We see some variation here, but it's not tremendous. And the biggest variation is between Chinese Americans with the strongest levels of support and Filipino Americans with the least, but still the supermajority supporting that. Next slide. We find significant differences, not surprisingly, by partisanship, and not many differences by age. Next slide. And then when it comes to other factors like nativity, language spoken at home, and importantly, gender, we do not find statistically significant differences within the community. Next slide. The flip side of it, we don't find much support at all for a congressional ban on access to legal abortion nationwide. And there's not much of a difference when you look by race and ethnicity within the community. Next slide. And we do find some differences by partisanship, but note that only 24% of AAPI Republicans say that Congress should pass a law banning access to legal abortions nationwide. Let's go to the next slide. And again, as before, we don't see much in the way of differences by nativity, language spoken at home, and gender. Next slide. I'll just go through some of these relatively quickly here. Whether Congress should preserve the ability of states to set their own laws restricting abortion. Overall, API adults do not believe that this should be the case, which is our status quo right now with the Dobbs decision and what the Supreme Court has decided. We do see some variation with Chinese Americans more likely than Indian Americans, saying that Congress should preserve the ability of states to set their own laws allowing or restricting abortion. But it's possible that when people are answering this question, they might not be fully aware of how U.S. congressional law versus Supreme Court versus state decisions operate. So this potentially indicates some opportunities for greater education within our communities in terms of what this means, because some of these findings do not seem consistent with other findings, for example, among Chinese Americans and their support for a congressional law preserving access to abortion nationwide. Next slide. We see differences by party ID here, stronger differences than we've seen in other cases. And we also see some differences by age, where with older API adults more warm to this idea, but still not supporting it in a majority fashion, and younger API adults opposing the idea of Congress preserving the ability of states to set their own laws allowing or restricting abortion. Next slide. We see some differences here by nativity and by gender in ways that it did not pop up before, but these are not huge differences. Let's go to the next slide. We have a few more slides in terms of allowing abortion, states allowing abortions under certain conditions. We see overwhelming support to obtain a legal abortion if a fetal abnormality would prevent the child from surviving outside the womb. We do see lower support among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, but it's still supermajority support. Next slide. We see some differences here by partisanship, but again, note that 76% of Republicans support states allowing a pregnant person to obtain a legal abortion in this circumstance. Let's go to the next slide. We don't see much differences on this measure by nativity, language spoken at home, and gender. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide asks about whether the state should allow a pregnant person to obtain a legal abortion if the person's own health is seriously endangered by the pregnancy. We see overwhelming support across groups, including among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Next slide. We also see overwhelming support regardless of party identification and age. And next slide. We also see overwhelming support regardless of nativity, language spoken at home, and gender. Let's go to the next slide. In the case of rape or incest, states allowing a person to obtain a legal abortion, we see overwhelming support. And you'll see, let's go to the next slide, and the one after that, it's going to be a very similar pattern, right? Some differences by partisanship, but still overwhelming proportion of API Republicans supporting this. And then let's go to the next slide. You don't see much differences by nativity, language spoken at home, or gender. Next slide. And then finally, when it comes to obtaining a legal abortion for any reason whatsoever, we do see some differences where Asian Americans, 69% say yes, that states should allow a pregnant person to obtain a legal abortion for any reason, whereas Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are split on this issue, 46 to 49. We do see variation with Chinese Americans most likely to say yes, and Filipino Americans the least likely to say yes. Next slide. We see strong differences by partisanship here. 88% of Democrats saying yes, 40% of Republicans saying yes. And we do see some differences by age as well, with those 60 and over, the least likely to say yes, but they're still saying yes, 60% saying yes to allow legal abortion for any reason whatsoever. Next slide. And then finally, when it comes to nativity, gender, and language spoken at home, we don't see much in the way of differences. I believe we're at the end. Let's go to the next slide. If not, let's accelerate to the end, because I want to open it up for community conversation. So I believe we'll turn it over to Fontaine, who will introduce our next set of speakers.
Thank you, Karthik. And as a reminder to everyone, please do feel free to insert your questions into the Q&A, which will follow our community discussion. Hi, everyone. I am Fontaine Lowe, Deputy Director at AAPI Data, and I'm so pleased to be moderating today's community conversation with Connie Choi and Minnie Tamaraju. A little bit about our speakers for today. Connie Choi is the Chief Program and Strategy Officer at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. She has over 20 years of experience in the legal, nonprofit, and government sectors. She has prior experience working at the California Immigrant Policy Center, the National Immigrant Law Center, Public Advocates, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, just to name a few. She is known for a track record of designing civic engagement and policymaking strategies, as well as facilitating collaborations across diverse communities. Thank you so much for joining us today, Connie. Minnie Tamaraju is the President and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All. She has over 20 years of experience leading federal, state, and local levels, leading advocacy efforts around reproductive rights, gender justice, and racial justice. Her prior experience includes working with the Office of Personnel Management at the Biden-Harris administration, Planned Parenthood, and the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. She's also held leadership positions in many different states throughout the country, including California, Texas, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and New Hampshire. So we have quite a wealth of expertise in today's conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us. The question that I have to start us off is, as community leaders for whom these issues are near and dear, what do you see as the most important takeaways from today's results? And what do you see as the stories and human experiences that the data point to? Minnie, I see that you're already off mute, so I don't know if you'd like to start us off.
Sure, I'm happy to. And then I'll just start by saying thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody. I see a lot of good friends on the attendee list. So hello, everyone. And I also want to share that I'm on the board of NAPAWF, so I'm going to defer to Connie on a lot of these questions. But you kind of get a twofer because a lot of the work I still get to do in the API community, I do it with NAPAWF. So it's great to see everybody. Yeah, I mean, these findings, the good news is, we've been doing a lot of research and polling pre-Dobbs and post-Dobbs with a lot of the partner groups. And it's so important that you're doing this with the AP and, API data. It's very rigorous. It's very fact-based. We've done a lot of political polling as well from the persuasion side to understand where API voters are. And the great news is these results do affirm what we already knew, both from an organizing perspective, anecdotally, but also from the partisan research we've done as well, that API voters are squarely with organizations like ours in our position that reproductive freedom, including unfettered access to abortion, and reestablishing a federal right to abortion and expanding access are very popular positions in our community. And are not controversial. And I'll let Connie speak more to this, but we also have our own unique relationship as a community with reproductive freedom and abortion access, given our countries of origin, given, cultural biases and stigmas, and given the fact that so many of our communities are already marginalized from access to care and services beyond reproductive freedom, whether it's maternal health outcomes, whether it's, access to the whole range of services, including gender-affirming care. So for me, the top takeaways are this confirms what we already knew in a good way. It allows us to have more objective, nonpartisan analysis to lobby and effectively advocate with our policymakers. But it also, for all of the partner orgs on the call, should make it really, really clear that there is no doubt that this is a motivating issue. This is a salient issue. This is something you should be organizing around in 2024, whether you're partisan or not, whether you're electoral or completely C3. This is the galvanizing issue of the moment for so many of our communities. And we'd really love to partner with you as you think about how you're going to organize around this. Connie?
Thanks, Minnie. Yeah, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today as well. Basically want to underscore a lot of what Minnie shared. I mean, for us, this data elucidates the following, that number one, that not only do API women support reproductive justice issues, And we really appreciate this finding, but that also AAPI men do. For women, this support has gotten stronger since our polling 4 years ago, where we found that 7 in 10 AAPI women support legal abortion. And two, that this support not only remains strong when it comes to abortion access, but across the range of reproductive justice issues. So, as Minnie mentioned, family planning, birth control, prenatal care, gender-affirming medical care for trans and non-binary folks, we've seen this as well. And when considering this broader lens, this also tracks with our findings, where we found last year that 85% of AAPI women believe that women should have the right to make their own reproductive choices writ large. In addition, and more importantly, as Minnie alluded to, our work with the Harris poll shows that AAPI women are highly engaged and will turn out to vote based on reproductive justice issues. In fact, we found that 8 in 10 AAPI women voters support candidates who respect their reproductive freedom and autonomy. And as a reminder, harkening back to 2020, the AAPI community was part of that margin of victory in key swing states like Arizona, Michigan, Texas, and Wisconsin, which all led to President Biden's win, 4 years ago. And specifically, what we found in our polling in 2021 was that women are actually doing more than just turning out. 7 in 10 have actually been engaged in political activities leading up to the 2020 elections. And so they watched debates, they signed petitions, they engaged in educational activities, lobbied government officials, and donated to organizations. And so to what Minnie said, this is actually provides strong reason to really get out the vote and turn out our community, right, on the basis of reproductive justice issues alone. And, I think just looking forward, when considering women of color voters writ large, they are an increasingly powerful voting bloc. We make up about 20% of the population, and by 2050, we're going to be making up a majority of women in the U.S. And so I think a lot of the women that we found in the last presidential election were first-time voters, specifically South Asian voters, women ages 25 to 34. And so there's a lot of opportunities, and really would encourage our partners on this call to join us in really making sure that the AAPI community shows up.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. I mean, I think that it is just definitely, something that I've seen in my circles, and just kind of so heartening to hear that it kind of shows up, in the data as well. One of the questions that's in the Q&A is certainly to kind of just to understand and speak more to perhaps the battleground states and in your work nationally. How have you seen, or how do you seen or expect, these perspectives among AAPI women to play out?
Yeah, we did exit polling in 2022, and then we've been at the table. We have a pretty significant presence in several battleground states: Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Georgia, to be precise. And both in our state efforts and in our exit polls in 2022, these numbers are compatible with what we've seen. AAPI voters, and I thank you, Connie, for flagging both men and women, but particularly younger voters, right? What we've seen is a surge in youth voter engagement on this issue, particularly in the states where we've had abortion on the ballot in the form of a constitutional question or referendum. We've seen a surge in voter activation by voters of color, particularly AAPI women and men. So I think what's really interesting, and I don't know whether your poll breaks it down to this level for Carrie's question, but I will say, from looking at comparable data in other election cycles since Dobbs, we know that these voters are very motivated. Again, the salience is very high. They're very motivated. And that even applies to AAPI and voters of color who are younger, who are previously identified as Republican or independent. So we know that this has become a really urgent crisis for these communities. Folks are very motivated. And in the battleground states, particularly I think in Georgia, and I think Connie can speak more to that, NAPOP has a very strong membership in Georgia, we're seeing a lot of new organizing happening in communities of color, particularly AAPI communities. And I will say anecdotally in Arizona, I was just in Arizona meeting with our folks on the statewide ballot initiative. We have AAPI coalition partners on the ground working on that effort, as well as in Nevada. So it's not just voters, it's also how organizations are showing up in terms of activation around these issues.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to your previous question, Fontaine, because I think it's not just about the opportunity to really bring up voters, but for me, this data really shows the high stakes by which the AA and HPI community feel both men and women when it comes to ensuring that women have full autonomy over their bodies. And when you're actually looking at the numbers, the API community is the only group that has used abortion, where use of abortion has not decreased over the past 15 years. As many as 1/3 of API pregnancies may end in abortion, according to CAP, the Center for American Progress. And when we're looking at pre-Dobbs, post-Dobbs, 1.3 million API women and non-binary people, more than a quarter of women writ large, ages 15 to 49, live in 26 states that have banned or are likely to ban abortion. And so really, when you're looking at outside impacts to our community, it's there. And what the data today doesn't show when going deeper, and that NAPAWF has found in our research, is that our community also faces a range of barriers to care. So, when it comes to health access as relates to immigration status, language access, economic security or lack thereof, they're all intricately intertwined. And to what Minnie alluded to, there's a stigma writ large when it comes to abortion and sexual and reproductive health. And so, I think that the community is not only they're really kind of suffering disproportionate impacts when it comes to this type of these types of issues writ large when it comes to their day-to-day. So
yeah, I mean, and even as you're speaking, definitely I think what is very clear through all of the slides that Karthik went through is the overwhelming support and almost among men and women across communities within the AAPI umbrella. In some ways, I feel like it's almost a bit of a myth busting of sorts, given some of the stereotypes about gender dynamics in the AAPI community. So I mean, I think it is just kind of such an amazing kind of piece to kind of understand and kind of for you to highlight earlier, Connie. I would say that as you speak to the group and community here, and as you think about what is upcoming for this election year, what are some of the things that you would say as key takeaways for this group to take as they move forward?
Either of us? Or we're starting with Connie?
No, go for it, Minnie.
Sure. Okay, so I just I dropped a link in the chat for a report we did at the end of 2023 on young voters and voters of color that had a couple of top lines on AAPI voters, just to sort of show how similar the findings are. I mean, look, I don't. It's so interesting to rewind pre-Dobbs. I was on a ton of calls where we were still having to persuade progressive organizations and colleagues in the research space that we had a believability gap that Roe could fall. And we were having to do a tremendous amount of education that not only could it fall, it likely would fall. And here's what the results would be, right? There was a lot of disbelief that we would have that we would lose what was a sacred, right, constitutionally guaranteed right for over 50 years in this country. So now that we're in this post-Dobbs environment, we've seen almost like whiplash, like so much dramatic shift in public opinion. Now, voters of color have consistently been with us on this issue, but we still had a believability gap by mainstream organizations, including the news outlets, right? Including the mainstream progressive orgs about where voters of color stood. So I would say for the folks on this call who are not only advocates for our communities, but are also sitting in places of decision-making on expenses, how we resource organizations, how we fund campaigns, how we mobilize around issues, this data should make it extremely explicit and clear, put to bed. any sense that abortion's not salient to our communities, that it's not a vital, issue for access in our communities, and coupled with the research you did on gender affirming care, that these are controversial issues that our communities that you should be nervous about when talking to our communities. So I think we intuitively know this. This is important to share with candidates that you're lobbying. This is important to share to mainstream leaders of progressive orgs who may be somehow nervous and think this is a community I shouldn't talk to these issues about. This is a winning issue across all our communities. And when you're resourcing outreach to these communities, you need to robustly fund that, right? You can't think about, well, here's our AAPI pot of money, but then here's our women's pot of money or our reproductive freedom pot of money, for voter outreach. You should be looking at these numbers and realizing this is a really smart place to target all of those messages and motivate and empower organizations of color that can authentically speak to these communities. They should be resourced. Those spokespeople should be present. There's just never been enough of that in any of our movements. And this research should really help you understand how powerful this message is, but also how critical, once you do win office or once you are able to be a policymaker, these policies are to your API constituents. Like, that's the final piece. So, come 2025, this is going to be just as important for us to make sure we tell folks this is how you serve your communities the best, by addressing these issues at the federal, state, and local level.
I couldn't have said that any better. I think the one thing that I would add is, tomorrow there's going to be a huge rally in front of SCOTUS where they're going to be hearing a case on medication abortion. And so, when it's not just Dobbs, but other, ways in which they're trying to curtail the rights and reproductive freedoms of all women, not just API. And so I think that and I think, as an attorney myself, I am very clear that a legal strategy is not going to be enough. And so investments in that ground game, right, in terms of really making sure that our community shows up to, support organizations that are actually trying to pursue a comprehensive policy solution, right? Not just looking at abortion, but really that range of like RJ issues that we all care about is actually going to be quite key. And so I think, and then, I think just every day what I try to ground myself is in, the stories that we hear, right? And I, when it comes to women who are especially, I think a lot of low-wage earners, right, who are facing those day-to-day difficulties in terms of accessing, not only abortion, but, just comprehensive healthcare services writ large. And so I think, just trying to remember, those folks that, that we as advocates, right, need to be showing up for them specifically as much as we can.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I might ask Casey if you mind also spotlighting Karthik. I believe we have various questions that will certainly benefit from all three of your attention. So one of the questions that is in the Q&A, can you offer any insight into some of the discrepancies between NHPIs and Asian Americans on legal abortion more broadly? And between Filipinos and other Asian ethnicities?
So I'll just start and leave it to others who know much more kind of on the ground intelligence, and especially in an organizing context. I mentioned, religious affiliation as one factor. Prior surveys that that I've done and also that I've seen, populations that have a higher proportion of Catholics have, or have maybe more conservative or less liberal opinion, although even among Catholic and other Christian communities, among Asian Americans, we have seen them to be more progressive than the general population in those communities. So religion certainly plays a factor. But for other factors, I would say that some of it goes the other way as well, in which one might typically think of as foreign-born or kind of naturalized citizens, first-generation immigrants, as being more conservative on issues. Many Asian immigrants come from countries where there's far greater reproductive access than the United States has. So that's another factor that actually accounts for less variation than one might expect if you thought that religion were, the most important factor at play. But I'll leave it to the other experts here to know, what they have seen on the ground, from engaging in various communities.
Let me just add to that. I think when we're looking at harms to the community, and I've alluded to this in my previous remarks, API women who have large wage gaps are actually likely to be particularly harmed. And so, API women are overrepresented in service and low wage industries where there's less ability to get time off. They get lower pay. They have lack of access to health insurance. This is particularly true for such groups as Vietnamese Americans specifically. I think that when you're looking at considering immigration status, and Karthik knows this, API data, but 6 out of 10 APIs are immigrants and 16% are undocumented. And when you're considering the criminalization of abortion that's happened, especially in recent years, this heightens fears of adverse immigration consequences for undocumented individuals specifically, as well as other immigrants, right, regardless of their immigration status. And then, Karthik has talked about this a little bit with some of the data when it comes to nativity and language access. But 66% of Asian Americans and 30% of NHPIs speak a language other than English at home, right? And they experienced difficulties in accessing healthcare writ large due to these barriers. And so, they get further accentuated, I think, specifically for women who are, trying to seek out some of these services within a reproductive justice setting. And, and writ large, I think when it, and Minnie has talked about this, there is a stigma when it comes to reproductive health within the API community. And so that actually has also played, an outsized role where a lot of our community members have told us that really that stigma has been the most painful aspect of their abortion experience. And so I think that, and then I can go into all the history, but that'll be a longer discussion.
Yeah, I don't have anything new to add. I think they covered it in the interest of getting to more questions.
Thank you all. I also see a question from Denise Aquino. With such low voter turnout in the primaries, how do we activate and support our communities more to vote in the general election in October? I believe Connie and Minnie, you both kind of spoke to, reproductive rights as a key issue. But if you have any further thoughts specific to voter turnout.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, right? In my organization, as I alluded to before, we do partisan and nonpartisan work. I'll address this in a nonpartisan way. I think talking about this issue, abortion access and reproductive freedom in general, encompassing all the issues that Connie mentioned, maternal health, pay equity, the larger gender equity construct, the care economy, particularly for women of color voters, care economy issues, plus reproductive freedom issues, amplify the salience of both, because communities of color, particularly women of color, are the tip of the spear for their communities and their families in terms of the consequences of all these challenging, bans and lack of resources for these major caregiving concerns. So, there's a lack of community education on all of these issues. So to the extent you can be talking to your constituencies and your communities about the consequences of Dobbs, and footnote, I've recently seen some data that shows people don't know what Dobbs is. So talking about the overturning of Roe, or talking about abortion bans, or being very, very clear spoken about, like, this could affect your access to birth control. This can affect your access to IVF. Do you know the Supreme Court overturned Roe, a law that protected your access to reproductive rights? Really breaking it down for people and not making assumptions that everyone in our community is as plugged into these issues. The important thing to note is when we educate our communities about these issues, they vote. But that big question is when we, or if we, right? And how much of this info is getting to our communities, right? And what are the trusted, who are the trusted voices, and what are the trusted outlets where they get their information, and how much of this issue is penetrating to them. So we know it's salient but there's still a community education piece and a connecting the dots that you have to do to make sure voters understand why their vote matters.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to this is the importance of investments, right? So I think a fair amount of times our communities either were not seen as being big enough to matter, or people didn't know where our values were or what our priorities were. Now we have data that is much more clear in terms of where our community stands on that. So that excuse is no longer there. People will still try to come up with excuses, but knowing that elections hang on some very thin margins, and this is not just the presidential vote. When it comes to so many other offices, I think it'll be important for different types of institutions to be held to account in terms of how much they are or are not investing in communities, because many, as you said, you just can't assume because someone is affected by an issue that they're able to connect the dots, given the complexity of the policy landscape, and also just quite honestly just have turned off most people are from the rhetoric. I mean, and some would argue that maybe that's by design, is to turn people off from the political process. So I think there's a fair amount of community outreach and education that needs to happen.
Great.
Any further thoughts, Connie? So we have a few more questions in the Q&A, which I think is kind of about some of the data available and in this poll broadly. I would also just encourage folks, if you have any further kind of follow-up questions, please do include them in the Q&A function, especially as I think it's seldom that we have this wealth of expertise in Minnie and Connie all together. So I'm just going to go to the next question, and feel free to add more, folks. There is one question on the availability of voter data on Filipinx communities in each state. I believe, Karthik, you.
Yeah, so check out either API Vote or API Data. We have the state voter fact sheets so you won't have something which will show you the Filipinx breakdown across states, but you can go to all 50 states in DC and you'll see the size of the population in each of those states. We are hoping in May to have a better data tool that we already have. You can go to our community data hub at apidata.com under data. We have a new website, so things may be like in a little different spot than when you first found it. But if you go to apidata.com and you go to our data tab, you'll see demographic data, and you'll see some of those tools that you can access.
Thank you. And if one of our teammates can put that in the everyone chat, might be helpful. We have a question from Clem on the percentages from the initial finding slide around gender-affirming care, for example. Are there some folks who are neutral, or kind of is it implied? Yeah. What are the options of what?
Yeah. So I would encourage everyone to go, if you go to AP-Norc, there was a question that I answered in line about the methodology, the sample sizes, et cetera, and you can find that if you go to apnorc.org. I think it still might be on the main page, but it's under the API data topic. And on this question about does 56%, for example, supporting gender-affirming counseling or therapy for adults, does that mean that 44% oppose? No. So if you look at the report, you'll see that 56% either strongly favor or somewhat favor, 17% either strongly oppose or somewhat oppose, and then 26% neither favor nor oppose. So there's still a fair amount of persuadability, or maybe ambivalence, right? It could be that even if you talk to these folks, they still might not know where they land on that issue. So there are two ways that one could present that data, is to just say what percentage favor strongly or somewhat, or you could look at the gap between those who favor and those who oppose. So in this instance, you see, I'm just like quickly going to do math here, about a 3-to-1 ratio, right? In terms of either 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, it's 3.5-to-1, right? Many more favor gender-affirming counseling or therapy at 56% than the 17% that oppose. So there's two different ways that one could interpret those results, and we've broken it out so that people can interpret them the way that they find most persuasive.
Thank you, Karthik. So we do have a question, kind of as a follow-up to some of our discussion earlier. Do you know of a Get Out the Vote organization that is specifically targeting API women? API women are most influential in their families and their communities when mobilized and energized, something that dominant political culture will not recognize.
Connie, I think that's you.
Connie, this is for you, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. So for those who don't have not heard of NAPOF, NAPOF is actually dedicated to uplifting and building power with AA and HPI women and girls in the U.S. We actually use organizing, advocacy, communication strategies, as well as get out the vote strategies. And so we are ramping up for the election year this year.
Yeah.
Can I just put a quick plug to Fontaine?
Yes, absolutely.
So I just kind of want to highlight that NAPOF is actually going to be coming out with some new polling research in a few months that's actually going to be going deeper on what Karthik shared about how women of color voters feel about reproductive justice. And we're doing this as a collaborative with In Our Own Voice, the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, as well as the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. So I just want to plug it and to keep a lookout for that. And I'm also sharing our polling data from 2021 that actually kind of highlights some of the data about motivation to turn out, as well as, how women of color voters have turned out in the past as well.
And I might even ask a follow-up.
Connie, I see a question. Sorry if I'm jumping in here. I see a question about how folks can get involved. And I think, Connie, I dropped the link. I think you can be a member, but also there is a network of associations that work with NAPOF. And that's a way for folks who are on this call who represent orgs to engage as well. So send a note to Connie.
And there is I don't know if folks can pop in from the slide deck also the media emails could be ways in which your folks make sure that you can kind of get the right information you need, as well as connections to the right folks within both NAPOF and Reproductive Freedom for All. So my fellow friends could pop that in the chat. That would be wonderful. And Minnie, you anticipated as like the same follow-up question I was about to ask. I believe we have one more that we can discuss for today. The question from Swarna. In Texas, the abortion issue has been framed by religion, particularly the religious right. Suggestions on taking back that narrative in the most effective way in the South to do that.
So I'm a Texan. I worked on this issue for over a decade in Texas and still work on it in Texas as a national org. Couple of things, there's a reason. So I would push back a tiny bit on the assumption that it was religion, but I will say this: the anti-abortion movement is definitely driven by an evangelical extremist set of organizations and leadership. There is a fundamentalist backbone to this movement, origin story for this movement. It's very much driven by white supremacist leadership that are trying to assert power and control over women and people of color. Let's just be clear. That is the root cause. However, there are many spiritual and religious identifying people who are pro-reproductive freedom and pro-choice. That's really important. So we're happy to share links to our friends at Catholics for Choice, National Coalition for Jewish Women. There's NCJW. There's actually an Interfaith Alliance working on this. NAPOF has organizations in their network that represent that represent Muslim, Christian, and Hindu and Buddhist perspectives who are pro-reproductive freedom. So it's important not to buy the rhetoric that opposition to abortion access is actually rooted in religion. It's rooted in extremist white supremacy, which often gets disguised by the evangelical movement as religious, but it is not per se religion. That being said, our research and our work has shown, and it's why we changed our name from NARAL Pro-Choice America to Reproductive Freedom for All, that the best way to combat the choice versus life or some of the other binary challenging narratives about abortion access and reproductive freedom is using the freedom frame. And I'm happy to share research that we can disseminate with message boxes and how to walk through the freedom frame. But it means shifting the conversation from freedom to choose, right? Freedom to, or like right to choose, and life versus choice, which has always been a little challenging, even though Ari was one of the ones that pushed that narrative in the 80s and 90s, to freedom to decide. And here's the difference. The freedom to decide if, when, and how to have a family tests overwhelmingly well across religious demographics, across conservatives, Republicans, independents, progressives, moderates, across young people to older people demographically. Everybody can get behind a fundamental freedom. And a freedom to decide resonates most even with people who say, personally, they would not choose to have an abortion. They feel very strongly that the government should not be making that decision for them. And so this freedom from government interference and this freedom of bodily autonomy is particularly resonant with APIs, given our immigration stories, given our countries of origin, given some of the challenges with democracy our homelands have struggled with. The fundamental freedom to decide how to have a family is a really powerful message for our communities, but it's also a powerful message across all communities. So we can share that research. Listen, pro-choice is not an irrelevant term anymore. It just doesn't reflect the reality for so many communities of color and folks in banned states who never did have and currently do not have a choice under the ban. Happy to say a lot more about it, but I will send you the information.
Thank you, Minnie. Thank you all for this amazing discussion. I learned so much. We all learned so much from you. Kevin, please bring us home. I believe there will be some follow-up with all the great resources that Minnie and Connie spoke about.
Great. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Minnie and Connie and Karthik for, as always, a lot of great information this year. As I'm going to just repeat how incredibly important it is that we have this this amount of data that we've never had as much before, and we're so glad to be able to share it with all of you, particularly those of you who are partners who can take away with this. I will direct you. We will send a follow-up email in a couple of days with a summary of what was just spoken, additional resources that Minnie and Connie have mentioned. We'll include that in the email. You can also visit apiavote.org and API Data's new website, which is beautiful, by the way, and I hope you visit it just to look at how crazy beautiful it is. The data will also be available there. And again, thank you all for, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to, if I don't see you here tomorrow at America Votes, we will see you all soon. Thank you.